In the summer of 2017, Greenville, a quiet town nestled among the pine-lined highways and humid hills of eastern North Carolina, looked no different than hundreds of similar towns across the South. The streets were slow, families close-knit, and life revolved around church, school, and Saturday errands. At the heart of this community stood the Brooks family, regarded by many as the embodiment of virtue and faith. At the helm was Pastor Jonathan Brooks, a man whose reputation extended far beyond the white-painted walls of New Mount Olive Baptist Church. At 46, Jonathan had already served as senior pastor for more than a decade, delivering sermons that drew in congregants not just from Greenville, but from neighboring counties as well. He was known for his calm demeanor, his deliberate cadence when preaching, and his seemingly endless supply of parables and spiritual wisdom. On Sundays, he stood tall at the pulpit in tailored suits, one hand resting gently on a worn leather Bible, his voice steady and warm as he spoke of grace, redemption, and the power of prayer. His flock adored him. Church elders praised his leadership. Mothers brought their children to be blessed by him. Couples requested private counsel. To the outside world, Jonathan Brooks was a beacon of moral clarity in uncertain times. Beside him, always just a step away, was his wife, Lorraine. At 43, she possessed the composure of someone who had spent years in the orbit of public life without ever drawing too much attention to herself. She wore modest dresses, coordinated hats, and a cross pendant that rarely left her neck. Her presence was quiet but constant, organizing food drives, overseeing Sunday school, volunteering at the county shelter, and coordinating prayer circles for the sick and bereaved. She was known for her generosity, her thoughtful thank you notes, and her uncanny memory for birthdays and anniversaries. Their marriage was considered exemplary, a union rooted in faith and service. Their home sat on the southern edge of town, past the diner and the high school football field, on a shaded cul-de-sac lined with magnolia trees. It was a two-story house with cream-colored siding, green shutters, and a wide front porch adorned with a pair of rocking chairs and hanging flower baskets. The lawn was always trimmed, the bushes manicured, and the flag by the mailbox changed with the seasons. Inside, the house radiated warmth and structure. Family portraits lined the staircase, hymnals sat neatly on the coffee table, and every corner carried the scent of baked apples and polished wood. Evenings were marked by routine, dinner at 6, Bible reading at 7, and lights out by 10. Their two teenage children, Marcus and Eliza, were well-mannered, polite, and active in the church youth choir. To anyone passing by, the Brooks family appeared untouched by hardship, buffered by the protective walls of faith, discipline, and tradition. But behind the curtains of that perfect house, small signs of wear began to show. Lorraine started to notice subtle shifts in Jonathan's behavior. He was coming home later than usual, claiming meetings had run long or that parishioners had sought private counsel. When he did return, he often seemed distracted, fatigued, and emotionally absent. He sat longer in silence, sometimes nursing a single glass of sweet tea for over an hour, staring through the window at the darkened street beyond. He no longer joined her in evening prayers. Some nights, he would claim exhaustion and retreat to the study instead of their bedroom. Physical intimacy, once tender and predictable in its rhythm, became increasingly rare. Lorraine chalked it up to stress. Jonathan had mentioned financial strains at the church, tithes were down, building repairs were mounting, and some elders were growing restless with his decisions. He spoke of burnout, of needing time to reflect, of bearing a spiritual burden that no one else could understand. Lorraine, always supportive, took him at his word. She made his favorite meals more often, encouraged him to rest, and took on more church responsibilities to lighten his load. But the unease lingered. There were moments when she found herself alone in the kitchen, staring at the untouched plate she had prepared, wondering where exactly he was that night. She noticed changes in his clothing, a cologne she hadn't bought, a shirt she hadn't ironed, unfamiliar receipts crumpled in his coat pockets. She ignored them at first. She told herself that he was just overwhelmed, that he would come around, that the man who once whispered scripture into her ear before bed was still the same. Yet her instincts whispered otherwise. There were too many unexplained absences, too many moments where he avoided her gaze. One night, as she folded laundry, she realized she hadn't laughed with him in weeks. Their conversations had become mechanical, filled with schedules and obligations, but devoid of real connection. His phone was always locked. His laptop, once shared freely at the kitchen counter, was now carried to and from the study with its charger in tow. The children began to notice the tension as well. Eliza asked why her father no longer led Grace at dinner. Marcus commented that he seemed grumpy all the time. Lorraine deflected, as mothers often do, protecting the illusion for as long as she could. But privately, she began to journal her thoughts, entries that read more like prayers than observations. She wrote of her confusion, her sadness, her longing for the man she married. She asked God to help her understand, to reveal what was happening beneath the surface of their life. Sunday services continued as always. Jonathan still preached with fervor, his voice unshaken, his scripture references precise. But Lorraine saw it now, an edge of performance behind the passion, a mask behind the righteousness. In moments when their eyes met across the sanctuary, she felt something hollow, as if the man on the stage had retreated deep within himself. The more she watched him, the more she wondered what he was hiding. She didn't yet know the truth. She didn't know how far the cracks extended beneath their carefully maintained facade. But she felt it, undeniably, their perfect life was no longer whole. Something terrible was pushing its way to the surface, and when it did, nothing in Greenville would ever look the same again. In the second week of October, just as the first signs of autumn colored the streets of Greenville in amber and rust, Lorraine returned home from the market to find a single envelope resting in the mailbox. It had no return address. The handwriting was careful, almost too neat, and her name, just her first name, was written in black ink. Inside was a single slip of paper. No threats, no explanation. Only a typed line, "Look at the folder named Service Archive on Jonathan's laptop. Documents Ministry Files Archive October." Her hands trembled slightly as she read it again. There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. The note seemed oddly clinical, more like an instruction than a warning. For the rest of the afternoon, Lorraine tried to focus on routine. She shelved the groceries, watered the houseplants, and answered emails. She folded laundry, checked on her children's homework, and even sat down to write thank you cards for the church bake sale. But her thoughts circled the note like a hawk above prey. The line repeated in her head again and again, a whisper that grew louder with each passing hour. By evening, as twilight descended and the streetlights outside flickered on, Jonathan announced that he would be heading back to the church for a late counseling session with a parishioner. It wasn't unusual. He often returned to the sanctuary after dinner. But tonight, Lorraine barely responded. She nodded, barely looking up from her teacup, and waited until she heard the front door close behind him. She moved quickly, as though her body knew the path before her mind could catch up. Upstairs, in Jonathan's study, the door was half closed. The laptop sat precisely in the middle of the desk, its lid closed but not powered down. It hummed faintly, a soft glow seeping from the edges. Her heart thudded in her chest, heavy and disjointed. For a moment she paused, standing before the desk as if waiting for some sign, some bolt of reason to stop her. But none came. She opened the laptop. The screen sprang to life. The desktop was organized, as always, with neatly labeled folders. She navigated quickly, documents, then ministry files, then archive, then October. A folder appeared. It was locked with a password. She stared at the prompt. Without thinking too long, she typed the date of their wedding anniversary. The cursor blinked once, then the folder opened. There were 7 video files. Each labeled by a date, none more than a few months apart. Her fingers hovered above the touchpad. She clicked the first one. The screen filled with the interior of a dimly lit room. A camera had been set up on a tripod. In the center of the frame was a twin bed covered with white sheets. A young man lay on it, shirtless, motionless. He appeared unconscious, breathing shallowly. Moments later, Jonathan walked into frame. Lorraine recoiled as if struck. But she did not stop the video. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen, wide, unblinking. Jonathan moved with purpose, his expression unreadable. He adjusted the lighting, checked the camera's angle, then turned his attention to the figure on the bed. Lorraine's breath hitched. Her entire body tensed. She watched in silence, her chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. The video continued for several minutes before fading to black. She opened the second video. Then the third. Each one was the same. Different young men, some fair-skinned, some dark, some barely stubbled, but always unconscious. Always in that same sterile room. Jonathan always calm, composed, as if this were a routine task. No hesitation. No remorse. Just precision. She noted the camera work, stable, well-framed, almost clinical. The lighting never faltered. Each recording was time-stamped. Each one more damning than the last. By the time she reached the final video, Lorraine was no longer crying. Her face had gone cold, her jaw rigid. The tears had dried into tight streaks along her cheeks. She watched everything. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because she needed to see. To be sure. To gather every last thread of truth before her world collapsed entirely. When the final screen went dark, she closed the laptop and backed away from the desk. The room felt smaller now, the air thick and oppressive. She moved to the hallway, stumbling slightly as she reached for the wall. The house was silent, the kind of silence that made even footsteps sound foreign. Somewhere below, the refrigerator hummed. A car passed by outside. But inside her, there was only static, roaring, painful static. An hour passed before Jonathan returned. Lorraine sat at the kitchen table, hands folded, gaze vacant. He greeted her with familiar weariness, poured himself a drink, and sat opposite her. She said nothing. Her expression betrayed nothing. She listened as he offered explanations, fractured sentences, confessions framed in desperation. He spoke of a sickness, of shame, of secrets too heavy to carry. He begged for forgiveness. He promised change. He pleaded with her not to go to the authorities, claimed it would ruin them both. Lorraine nodded when expected. She offered comfort in soft movements and stillness. She told him she forgave him. She even held his hand as he wept. But her eyes no longer held warmth. The forgiveness she extended was hollow. It was not offered to absolve. It was offered to survive. She knew that from that moment on, her life would be divided into before and after. Before the folder. Before the videos. Before the monster was unmasked. And after, where nothing could ever be restored. That night, Jonathan slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Lorraine lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, her hands clenched beneath the covers. The house remained still, as if suspended in time. But within her, the world had shifted irrevocably. She had seen the truth. And nothing, no prayer, no sermon, no promise, could ever erase it. January arrived with a bitter stillness in Greenville. The trees stood bare, their branches etched like veins against the gray sky, and the streets carried a frozen quiet that seemed to muffle every sound. On one such morning, a Monday layered in frost and silence, Lorraine Brooks awoke in a house already changed. The sun had not yet risen, and the bedroom was cloaked in pale blue shadows. The air inside felt still, unnaturally heavy, as if time itself was holding its breath. She reached out instinctively to touch her husband, expecting to find the warmth of his shoulder, the faint rhythm of his breath. But Jonathan's body was cold. His chest lay unmoving beneath the covers, his mouth slightly parted beneath the mask that was meant to keep him alive. The oxygen tank beside the bed stood idle, its indicator dark. The hissing sound that usually accompanied it, the low, constant exhale of regulated air, was absent. It had been switched off. Lorraine sat still for a long moment, as if her body had yet to process what her eyes and skin already knew. Her pulse slowed. There was no panic, no gasp of horror. Only silence. Eventually, she rose, walked to the hallway phone, and dialed emergency services. Her voice was steady as she explained that her husband wasn't breathing, that she had just woken up and found him unresponsive. She gave their address. She waited by the door. When the paramedics arrived, they moved quickly and quietly, as professionals trained for tragedy. They examined Jonathan, checked for signs of life, ran their routine procedures. Then one of them removed the oxygen mask and gently closed his eyes. Lorraine stood back, arms crossed loosely in front of her, eyes fixed on the edge of the kitchen doorway. She nodded when they told her he was gone. The preliminary cause was listed as respiratory failure related to obstructive sleep apnea. Jonathan had been diagnosed nearly a year earlier after repeated complaints of daytime fatigue, morning headaches, and episodes of gasping during the night. A sleep study confirmed the severity of his condition. His doctor had prescribed nightly use of a CPAP machine with supplemental oxygen, warning that without it, the apnea episodes could become dangerous. Jonathan resisted the therapy at first, uncomfortable with the sensation of the mask and the idea of needing help to sleep. He called it a weakness. Eventually, at Lorraine's urging, he accepted the oxygen tank setup with minimal resistance. But he often removed the mask midway through the night or forgot to switch on the machine altogether. No one questioned the scene. The oxygen supply line was unplugged, but not forcibly. The tubing had simply been detached, the valve turned off at the tank. The coroner noted this, but concluded it was consistent with accidental misuse or a malfunction during sleep. Given Jonathan's medical history and aversion to the equipment, the death was quickly classified as natural. No autopsy was ordered. No further examination was deemed necessary. The news spread quickly through the community. Pastor Brooks, beloved leader, guiding voice, husband, father, had passed away in his sleep. Shock rippled through the congregation like a sudden storm. Messages poured in. Calls, cards, casseroles. Lorraine, now cast in the role of grieving widow, received them all with bowed head and trembling hands. She allowed herself to cry in public, but never collapsed. Her children clung to her sides, confused but obedient, dressed in dark coats and polished shoes. The funeral was held that Friday at New Mount Olive Baptist Church. It was standing room only. Parishioners filled the pews, the aisles, the back wall, all to pay final respects to a man they had called shepherd. The choir sang soft hymns. Former students, community leaders, and neighboring pastors delivered eulogies. Stories were shared about his wisdom, his humor, his compassion. A slideshow played images of him baptizing newborns, shaking hands at weddings, raising his arms in Sunday praise. Lorraine sat in the front row with Marcus and Eliza, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Occasionally she nodded. Occasionally she wept. Mostly, she sat still. After the service, mourners gathered in the fellowship hall for refreshments and recollections. The room buzzed with voices speaking in hushed reverence. Plates of fried chicken, cornbread, and pound cake passed between hands. Condolences were offered in steady streams. Lorraine accepted each one with practiced grace. She was told she was strong, that Jonathan would be proud, that God had called him home for reasons no one could understand. She thanked them, one by one. In the weeks that followed, the house changed little. Jonathan's study remained untouched, his shoes still lined up beside the door, his coffee mug still sitting in the sink. Lorraine moved through the days as if floating slightly above them. She handled insurance paperwork, notified the church board, and oversaw the installation of a commemorative plaque in the church foyer. Her children returned to school. The meals resumed. The house grew quieter. To those on the outside, it seemed that she had entered a season of mourning with dignity. There were no outbursts, no erratic behavior. If anything, Lorraine became even more involved in church affairs, organizing memorial services for other families, leading prayer groups, returning to teach Sunday school. People called her graceful. They admired her poise. They believed she had found peace through her faith. But at night, when the house was still and no one could see, Lorraine would sit in the dark living room, eyes fixed on the shadows shifting across the floor, and feel the weight of silence pressing into her skin. It was not grief that settled over her, but something colder, deeper. A kind of resignation that came not from loss, but from knowing a truth too terrible to share. Jonathan was gone. But he had not been taken. He had been allowed to slip into that final breathless sleep. And the world would never know. 1 month after the funeral, just as the town of Greenville began to settle back into its rhythm, the county sheriff's department received an anonymous call. The voice on the line was calm, clipped, and offered no identifying details. The caller claimed that the recent death of Pastor Jonathan Brooks had not been natural, that it was not what it appeared to be. They instructed the investigator to look at the pastor's personal laptop. They didn't elaborate. They didn't call back. Ordinarily, a vague tip about a deceased community leader might have been dismissed as a cruel prank or a grief-stricken delusion. But something in the tone of the message, in the quiet certainty of the words, lodged in the mind of Detective Samuel Coates, a senior investigator with the county's Criminal Investigations Unit. He had attended the funeral. He had seen the outpouring of grief, the near-reverent awe surrounding the late pastor's legacy. But he had also seen strange things in his line of work, things hidden beneath years of respectability. He decided to pursue it, if only to rule it out. He filed a petition with the county magistrate for a limited search warrant. With the coroner's report listing sleep apnea as the cause of death and no autopsy on record, the case technically remained closed. But a warrant was granted on the grounds of reasonable suspicion, citing the anonymous tip and the public nature of Brooks's position. 2 deputies visited the Brooks residence. Lorraine handed over the laptop without resistance. She asked no questions, only nodded and returned to the kitchen. The laptop was taken to the department's digital forensics lab. It was a relatively modern machine, password protected but not encrypted. The analyst began with a basic sweep, checking for hidden files, deleted directories, and recovery points. Within hours, the contents of a previously erased folder were restored. The videos appeared in a single directory, organized by date and labeled with generic names, session__01, session__02, and so on. No metadata was altered. No attempts had been made to permanently destroy the files. Detective Coates viewed the first video in a darkened office with the blinds drawn. What he saw silenced him for several minutes. He played the second, then the third. The pattern was clear. Each recording featured a young man, likely between the ages of 18 and 20, lying unconscious on a bed in what appeared to be a guest room. Pastor Brooks entered the frame in each video. His behavior was methodical, clinical, and consistent. There were no signs of struggle, no audible sounds, only the quiet motion of someone committing an act of absolute control. Coates paused after the 5th video and stepped out of the room. His hands trembled slightly. He contacted the chief medical examiner's office and requested a consultation. He explained that new evidence had surfaced regarding a recent death previously ruled as natural. He asked for a reassessment of the circumstances surrounding Brooks's passing, including the use, or non-use, of his prescribed medical equipment. A team was assembled. The original scene of death had been documented, but not preserved in detail. However, Coates obtained photos from the paramedics and the medical technician's initial report. The oxygen tank was photographed in the off position, with tubing disconnected cleanly from the mask. There was no sign of malfunction. A review of Brooks's medical history confirmed his severe apnea and his reliance on the device for uninterrupted breathing during sleep. Forensic analysts concluded that, without the machine, an apnea episode of sufficient duration could have caused irreversible hypoxia or cardiac arrest. With mounting concern, Coates turned his attention to Lorraine. There had been no immediate suspicion of her involvement. Her grief had appeared sincere. Her behavior after the death had been appropriate, dutiful, quiet, composed. But now, with this new information, her proximity to the device, her knowledge of her husband's routine, and the disturbing contents on his computer, the focus of the investigation shifted. She was called in for an interview under the guise of follow-up questions. Initially, she said little. Her eyes remained steady, her hands folded in her lap. She neither affirmed nor denied knowledge of the videos. She requested time. She went home that evening without charges. 2 days later, just before the close of business, Lorraine walked into the sheriff's office without an appointment. She asked to speak to Detective Coates. She was escorted into an interview room, and when asked if she wanted legal representation, she declined. Then she spoke. Her voice was even, her words deliberate. She said she had watched the videos 2 months ago. She said she had seen them all. She said she had made a decision. That night, she had waited until Jonathan had fallen asleep, until his breathing had slowed, until the room was wrapped in stillness. Then she had walked to his side of the bed, disconnected the tubing from the oxygen tank, and turned off the valve. She returned to her side, lay down, and closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She listened. She felt the room grow quieter. She waited until there was nothing left to wait for. She told the detective that she had not done it in anger, nor in fear, but in certainty. Certainty that the man beside her was not the man the world believed him to be. Certainty that the boyish smiles and gentle voice were a disguise. Certainty that he would hurt others again, that justice through the legal system would never reach him. She said she did not believe in revenge. She believed in mercy, for his victims, not for him. Her confession was recorded in full. She made no excuses. She asked for no sympathy. She spoke plainly, without remorse, but also without triumph. She simply stated that monsters did not deserve to wake up. The interview ended with her being placed under arrest. Charges were drafted. Bail was denied. The town that had once praised her strength in mourning would soon struggle to understand the quiet resolve behind her actions. The investigation was no longer about the death of a respected pastor. It had become something far more complex, a confrontation between truth and image, silence and survival. The woman who had once stood at his side in church, smiling beneath her Sunday hat, now sat behind bars, awaiting trial for a death that no longer looked like fate but like justice shaped by human hands. The trial of Lorraine Brooks began in July 2018 in the Superior Court of Pitt County, under the sweltering weight of a Carolina summer and the watchful eyes of a town still struggling to reconcile the fall of a man they had once revered. The courtroom was filled each day, not with reporters or distant spectators, but with townspeople, churchgoers, neighbors who had watched Lorraine hand out hymnals, serve at potlucks, and smile beside her husband during Sunday sermons. They came not just for answers, but for clarity, for some semblance of understanding. The prosecution charged Lorraine with first-degree murder, presenting the case as premeditated and deliberate. They pointed to the methodical nature of the act, the oxygen supply disconnected, the mask undisturbed, no attempts to revive the victim. They emphasized that she had not sought help or reported any concerns to authorities before his death. They argued that justice demanded consistency, that no amount of personal horror justified taking a life without due process. Jonathan Brooks, they said, had been denied the opportunity to face consequences through the law. But the defense crafted a narrative grounded in psychological devastation. They acknowledged the act, never once denying Lorraine's role in her husband's death. Instead, they argued context. They introduced the recovered video files from Jonathan's laptop, each clip a meticulous record of abuse, filmed with intention, framed in disturbing clarity. They submitted psychiatric evaluations attesting to the extreme psychological trauma Lorraine had endured after viewing the recordings. Expert witnesses explained how prolonged exposure to such moral and emotional dissonance could result in a state of dissociation, helplessness, and eventual collapse of rational restraint. One forensic psychologist testified that Lorraine had suffered a catastrophic breach of reality, triggered by the realization that the man she had shared her life with for over 2 decades was not merely flawed but had committed atrocities. The betrayal was not just personal, they argued, it was existential. Her worldview, her identity, her faith, all had been shattered. Her act, they said, was not born of cruelty or revenge, but from prolonged moral anguish, compounded by isolation and silence. Witnesses from the community were called. Several members of New Mount Olive Baptist Church spoke of subtle changes in Jonathan's demeanor in the months before his death. One former youth volunteer recalled feeling uneasy during private counseling sessions with him but had never come forward out of fear or uncertainty. Others admitted they had sensed tension between the couple, though no one had suspected anything beyond the ordinary trials of marriage. Crime scene analysts returned to the stand to confirm that the oxygen valve had been deliberately turned off, that there were no signs of malfunction or accident. But they also noted the absence of defensive wounds, signs of struggle, or chaos, details that supported the theory that Lorraine had acted in silence, fully aware, fully composed, not in a burst of rage but in calculated stillness. Throughout the proceedings, Lorraine remained calm. She listened. She answered when spoken to. Her testimony, when it came, was neither dramatic nor evasive. She spoke plainly of the night she discovered the videos, the sickening hours that followed, the confusion and nausea that gripped her. She described living in the days after that as if submerged, walking through her home, cooking meals, praying with her children, all while carrying the weight of what she now knew. She recalled lying awake at night, staring into darkness, listening to the rhythmic rasp of Jonathan's snoring, the deep pauses where breath should have been. She explained how she came to see each of those pauses as moments of decision, moments when she asked herself whether to reach out, to help, to allow another day to begin. And then, finally, one night, she didn't. The recordings played in court were sealed from public release, but a portion was viewed by the jury. The room fell silent as the grainy images moved across the screen, the sound of steady breathing from the unconscious victims, the quiet movements of a man who had once preached about salvation and grace. The videos were not just damning, they were haunting. The footage served not only as proof of Jonathan's crimes but as a window into the horror Lorraine had kept buried beneath a mask of devotion. Closing arguments revealed the chasm between law and morality. The prosecution called for adherence to statute, reminding the jury that the justice system cannot function when individuals take the law into their own hands. They acknowledged the tragedy, even the horror, but maintained that Lorraine's choice could not be excused. The defense, however, asked the jury to consider a different kind of justice, one rooted in humanity and context, an unbearable psychological burden. They urged the panel to consider not just what Lorraine had done, but what had been done to her. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty of involuntary manslaughter with diminished capacity. It was not the full weight of murder, but it was not absolution either. It was a verdict born of conflict, one that acknowledged both the letter of the law and the unbearable complexity of the case. Lorraine Brooks had acted outside the law, but not entirely outside reason. Her sentence would reflect that fragile middle ground. The judge, addressing the courtroom, spoke of sorrow rather than punishment, of tragedy layered upon tragedy. As Lorraine was led away in handcuffs, there were no gasps, no outrage, only quiet resignation. The trial had done what it was meant to do. It had revealed, dissected, and, in some fractured way, cleansed. Not the past, not the pain, but the silence that had protected it for so long. The community could no longer claim ignorance. The truth had been spoken, and the court had listened. Lorraine Brooks was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 7. The courtroom had already emptied by the time the sentence was handed down. There was no applause, no protest, only the quiet shuffle of paper and the sound of a gavel marking the end of a long, painful reckoning. Lorraine accepted the verdict with the same expression she had worn since the trial began, still, controlled, unyielding. She did not cry. She did not argue. Her hands were cuffed, and she was led away from the courthouse with her shoulders straight, as if carrying a burden that had long since fused into her spine. Her children, Marcus and Eliza, were placed in the care of Lorraine's sister, who lived in Wilmington. The transition was quiet, discreetly arranged by the court with the support of child welfare services. The children had been shielded from much of the trial, but not from the consequences. They stopped attending their former school. They no longer went to church. In public, they kept their heads low, as if trying to erase their last name. At night, they asked questions to which no one had answers. Back in Greenville, the new Mount Olive Baptist Church underwent a series of abrupt changes. The deacon board convened an emergency session, after which Pastor Jonathan Brooks's name was removed from all official documents and communications. His image was taken down from the Wall of Honor in the church foyer. Archived sermon recordings featuring his voice were taken offline. The church website was redesigned. His biography vanished. The memorial stone erected in the church's garden, engraved with his favorite scripture and a quote about servant leadership, was defaced with spray paint less than a week after the sentencing. Words like liar, monster, and betrayer were scrawled across the polished granite. Within days, the stone was removed entirely and replaced with a simple bench dedicated to unnamed victims of abuse. No formal statement was issued. The silence spoke louder than any condemnation. The videos found on Jonathan's laptop were forwarded to federal authorities. As forensic analysts worked through the files, facial recognition software helped identify several of the young men seen in the recordings. A few were located in neighboring states. They were contacted quietly, individually, with the support of trauma counselors and legal representatives. Most of them claimed to have no memory of the events. One admitted to a gap in recollection after a counseling session with the pastor years earlier, but said he thought it had been stress-related. None of them filed charges. Shame, fear, confusion, all of it blended into a heavy fog of inaction. The federal investigation continued for months behind closed doors, but it generated little public attention. Officials chose not to release further details, citing the sensitivity of the case and the privacy of the individuals involved. No new indictments were issued. No further arrests made. For the community, it was easier to move forward if the past remained buried. Whispers remained. Conversations and lowered voices, shared between churchgoers in parking lots, teachers in break rooms, mothers in grocery store aisles. People asked if others had known, suspected, heard anything strange. Most denied it. A few admitted to unease they had dismissed at the time. No one claimed responsibility. No one wanted to believe they had missed something so dark, so near. As time passed, the town adapted its memory. Pastor Brooks became a name that was not spoken. His sermons, once quoted in bulletins and newsletters, faded from collective use. New leadership filled the vacuum. The congregation shrank briefly but stabilized. Sunday services resumed. Choirs sang. Babies were baptized. The rhythms of small-town faith reasserted themselves, even as something colder lingered underneath. Lorraine, meanwhile, served her sentence at a medium-security facility in the western part of the state. She declined interviews. She did not appeal the conviction. She refused all requests for comment from journalists, advocacy groups, and religious reform organizations. Inside, she kept to herself. She participated in prison programs, maintained a clean record, and followed the rules. She was described by staff as quiet and composed. The other inmates knew who she was, but few spoke of it. In her cell, she kept a Bible, a photograph of her children, and a single folded letter she had never sent. She wrote often, not to anyone in particular, but as a form of discipline. Her journals, neatly stacked in cardboard boxes under her bed, were filled with reflections on silence, guilt, faith, and judgment. She never described what she did as justified. She never used the word hero. She knew it had been a crime. But in the deep, wordless place within her, she believed it had also been a kind of justice. Not one granted by courts or scripture, but one demanded by conscience. No parole hearing had been scheduled yet, but as the years passed, those close to her case began to debate whether she should be granted early release. Some believed she had suffered enough. Others insisted that punishment must remain intact. But Lorraine herself never submitted a request. She did not seek freedom as a prize, nor forgiveness as absolution. She simply endured. In Greenville, life continued. Children grew. Buildings changed. Names faded. And yet, on certain nights, in the quiet of their homes, some residents still remembered his voice, the deep timbre of his preaching, the way he moved his hands as he spoke. And then, just as quickly, they pushed the memory away, chilled by the knowledge that a man who once guided their prayers had hidden his sins behind the very pulpit that gave him power. The legacy of Jonathan Brooks had been dismantled, piece by piece, word by word. But Lorraine's silence remained intact, not as denial, but as testament. The final act of her life before prison had been to end his. Every day that followed was a long echo of that choice, reverberating through a world that would rather forget.